Okay, I'm Joe Farrell, Professor Joe Farrell. I suppose I'm entitled to be known at this stage of my life. I was in Blairs between 1958 and 1963. In other words, I joined in second year. I didn't do the full 6-year course. From Motherwell, and
Okay, and I'm George Houston. I am a former pupil at Blairs as well. I was there from 81 to 86 when it closed, and I'm originally from Glasgow Diocese. Today we are here under the good grace of Monsignor Hugh at Holy Cross in Cross Hill, and we thank him for the use of the premises today. And today's date, for the record, is the 28th of January 2023. Just to confirm, Joe, you're giving us permission to have this interview, and you're comfortable enough. We can absolutely assure you that you will get first look at the output of this as well.
Well, yes, you have full permission, and I retain my right to sue you if in any way you slander me or make me look even more foolish than I might otherwise be.
Well, as we're finding in these interviews, we've got quite a lot of legal representatives in the Blairentian history, so I'm sure I'll be well defended by at least one of them. So listen, let's just kick off by tell us a little bit about the background of how you came to Blairs, you know.
This is a matter I've thought about quite a lot over the years. I come obviously from a very Catholic background. There were, on my mother's side, I had an uncle who was a priest. On my father's side, there was an aunt who became a nun. I've spoken quite also recently to some colleagues of mine, some contemporaries of mine, who said there came a certain stage in which they felt that they had genuinely a calling, genuinely a vocation. There's a good friend, Father Joe Boland, who recently, we're still in touch, the people in my firm, we're still in fairly regular contact by Zoom nowadays. And he remembers a precise incident in which he felt he was being called to the priesthood. I had no such incident at all. In retrospect, I think basically there was an anticipation that that is the way I was going to go. Now, I want to be very precise. That's not to say that I was pressurised by my family. There was a phrase current in Blairs and in Rome of particular boys that it was their mother. It was always the mother, never the father. The mother that had the vocation. That was not my case. I was not in any way pressured to go. On the other hand, there was an expectation that that's what was going to happen. That was the way I was going to go. So when I did it, it was me, said, yeah, I'd like to be a priest. That was actually as firm a declaration as ever I made. Nobody sat me down to discuss this, neither my parents, nor the parish priest, nor anybody else. The next thing I knew is I was being summoned for a medical examination with doctors in Motherwell. Then I was being called to do an examination to see if I was up to it. I had already done my first year in Our Lady's High in Motherwell. Having got through these things, the course was basically set. So I have to say that in my case, although this was an enormously important decision, I feel in retrospect that there was a certain superficiality in the way on which I went on that particular track. A superficiality which was backed up by a general acceptance and expectation in the people around me, particularly my family.
Very nice summation of how you got there. And can you remember your first day when you arrived at Blairs? What emotions that?
I remember the first day of arrival in Blairs with the clarity with which I can recall very few other days in my life. Starting off by being taken into the station, which doesn't exist any longer in Glasgow, getting on the train, full of the other boys who were going there, the bus journey out, and above all, the first sight of Blairs with the then rector, Stevie McGill, later Bishop McGill, standing there on the doorstep with this great enormous, foolish smile which he had on his face. He was a very emotional man, for better and for worse, actually, standing there, and we were then ushered in. Conditions with British Rail were very different in those days, so you could send your trunk on in advance, and we were then allocated a cubicle and we went into it. I remember, frankly, no feeling of joy. I was utterly disoriented in the place. A feeling probably made worse by the fact that I was going into second year, so the bulk of the class was already formed. There was a very large cohort of us going into second year, the same as me. This was 1958, so we were the generation of the post-war baby boomers. So we had a very large form, possibly the largest in the history of Blairs, but although I'm not sure about that. But I remember a feeling of intense loneliness, being utterly and absolutely lost, not knowing what I was doing, nor knowing particularly why I was there. I also remember crying my eyes out that night when eventually I went to bed. It's occurred to me more later on. I briefly worked with the children's panel, both as a reporter and then as a member, where we were dealing with children in trouble, some of whom we took away from their families to go to children's homes or to list day schools. And I contrasted the care with which social workers and other officials prepared the children and the family for a decision which very rarely the family actually wanted and was going to be a break for them. I've compared that with the suddenness with which we were suddenly uprooted and then moved into Blairs, where you were on your own. I mean, I didn't come across it. There was no brutality or anything of that sort, but just this feeling at the age of 11, 12, 13, in my case, you were then there facing a completely new life for which there was no preparation whatsoever. And I remember especially one experience I had the following day, or maybe 2 days later. I was walking over towards the Calvary, which there was in the gardens in Blairs. I was on my own and walking in there and suddenly realising that I was completely on my own, and this is the way life was going to be. That up until then you could imagine yourself to be a member of a unit, a family, above all. Now I was away, and it would not change back. I had not thought then of giving up. I would go home for holidays, but these would be just temporary things. This was the nature of life. This was the nature of the individuality of the human person. Oddly enough, years later, I read the great Austrian, one of the founders of psychoanalysis, Jung, and he described a very comparable experience walking through a mist and then coming out in the other mist and realising that he was an individual, that this was him. He was in his own body and in his own mind and was no longer part of the unit. I came to that recognition about the second or third day in Blairs, and it was a fairly devastating experience.
And how did things evolve thereafter? You know, you were in Blairs for 5 years thereafter. How did that become easier to deal with thereafter?
It became easier to deal with, yeah, substantially it is. In reality, in most occasions in life, in most circumstances, you're neither happy nor unhappy. I was not unhappy in Blairs. These were not days of misery and suffering for me. We had a fairly compact group. There was one guy who'd been there before me, and I suppose I could even say he was a bit of a bully towards me. I don't know why, there was no particular reason, and he didn't stay there very long. But that was absolutely the exception. Apart from that, the relations with the other lads in the forum, some of whom I still see, were harmonious, were friendly, we got on well. There was no terrible division about it. So things simply went forward. I had one experience that makes me different. That's to say, when I was in fourth year, I contracted a quite serious illness, TB, tuberculosis, and I had a bit of luck in that. In other words, as those who have been there will remember, there was a nun was appointed every year as sister infirmarian. It was never one of the priests. This was obviously regarded as a woman's job. But these good, well-intentioned women who were the nuns, some of whom were magnificent, lovely creatures, all of them were, but the one who was appointed as sister infirmarian, she didn't necessarily have any medical background. In fact, I remember one in particular who had a great belief in the medicinal qualities of malt. So people who went up to the infirmary with something, anything from a broken leg to a cold, were given a spoonful of malt. And as you were going up to queue up to see the sister infirmarian, you would pass by a line of people with a spoon in their mouth, sucking the malt, which the sister infirmarian of that time believed to be the universal panacea for everything. I'm sure it did nobody any harm, but I can't imagine it did them any good at all. My bit of luck was that when I took on well, the sister infirmarian was a qualified nurse, so she was able. So she identified me as having something more than the normal things that required you to be in there, and she summoned the doctor. And I remember the amazement. There were 5 of us in the infirmary, and the doctor gave me a very, very thorough examination, somewhat leaving the other lads that were there taken aback. Shortly after that, I was taken into hospital, the city hospital, and then where I was diagnosed as having tuberculosis. Nobody had any idea how I contracted it. I was in hospital for 6 months. Between that period, I later discovered that the hospital people had offered to have me sent back down, to Motherwell, so I could keep in touch with the family, but my family, and I was not consulted in this, were actually more keen that I should stay in contact with the college. So I was in this hospital, Tornadee, for this time. Tornadee was actually a luxury hospital. It had been a sanatorium specifically for people with tuberculosis. It had in principle become a general hospital, but in fact most people there had the same disease that I had. And basically, I suppose I'd got it at a good time, if I can put it that way, in the sense that they had developed the drug streptomycin, which cured tuberculosis, which previously had been incurable. And they had also been able to overcome the side effects, because some people who got streptomycin earlier on developed deafness, which didn't happen. Actually, it's happening to me now, but I think that's to do with the ageing process and nothing to do with having tuberculosis in there. So anyway, I had this unique experience. I was there all over the summer holidays. My parents came up quite regularly to visit me. There were visits from the college. They tried to give me some work to do, and I remember the stupefaction of the nurses when I was given some Greek to translate, and the nurses, they were absolutely marvellous. And there was I translating passages from Thucydides to their utter amazement and so on. The only negative thing in that, and I have referred back to this, the only time I genuinely met religious discrimination was in there, but that was with one person who turned out to be, well, he was in fact a minister of the Free Kirk, and one day, with tuberculosis, as you get better, you don't need to stay in bed, so you can get up for longer and longer periods every day. This Tornadee lady was very well appointed, and they had a tea room, and I sat down by chance at a table with a man who turned out to be a minister and another who turned out to be an elder in the Free Kirk. And first of all, they told me not to start eating until the minister said grace. That was fair enough. But then they wouldn't speak to me because I was identified as a Catholic. And truthfully, although I'm from the west of Scotland, notoriously sectarian and so on, that's the only single incident of discrimination, of sectarianism, which I've ever come across. Thereafter, I have to say, once they had diagnosed it, there were then complications, and there seemed to be a disagreement between the surgeon and the doctor over whether I would require surgery or so on. But it was quite a happy period. There are no pains associated with it. Anyway, I was away from Blairs for this quite extended period. I had been appointed sacristan in 4th year, which I loved. And normally you would proceed 4th year, 5th year, into 6th year, where you would become chief sacristan, though there would be another one alongside you. They had to make arrangements for that. And when I came back in 5th year, obviously I couldn't carry on as sacristan. Anyway, I had this experience which was specific to me of having contracted this disease. The college was marvellous. The priests came over frequently. The rector, during the summer months, Canon Francis Thompson, who later became Bishop of Motherwell, he came over very frequently when there was no one else in the college. So I had that specific experience, which was changed the nature of my recollection in Blairs to a very considerable extent. Yeah.
And during that 6 months, was there any at all interaction with some of the lads from your year? Did they come out to visit as well, or were they allowed?
No, that was, well, there were always certain curiosities in Blairs, and for some reason, well, first of all, there was the fear of infection. And apparently, after I was taken away, then a medical team came out to Blairs and everybody was vaccinated and so on. And it may have been for that reason the college authorities decided it was not a good idea to have them. So the only one who came to visit me over the summer was David McCrone, who later became a very distinguished professor in Edinburgh. He lives in Aberdeen, and he came out over the summer months. But no, the lads, my colleagues, no, they didn't come. But the priests came very frequently. Yeah.
Quite a unique experience for you.
Yes, it was. Yes.
And you know, thinking about the time that you spent in Blairs, and specifically the environment itself, what would you say are the most memorable areas of the Blairs estate that kind of formed such an important part of your time there?
Well, I would say first of all it was the companionship with the other lads. You were stuck together. I mean, it was a boarding school, a seminary, but we were there together. Fortunately, in most cases, everybody got on particularly well. We couldn't understand, or I couldn't understand at that time, the nature of the rule that you were not to go about in twos, that had to be always at least 3. I later discovered that the rule numquam duo was actually a very universal rule in seminaries. At the time, I had no problem with the education, and indeed some of the professors, as we called them, were actually extremely good. I remember especially Father Ben Donaghy, who was the teacher of French, and he spoke impeccable French. He would be one of the last who had gone to Paris before the de facto stopped that relationship. So in some subjects, obviously, we had a very good education. French, I remember. Also, as a matter of fact, in English, because the priest there, Father Koya, he'd been a teacher. He was a late vocation, as the subject, as the description was, and he was good. I've often wondered back to how things could have been had we had a wider course, because there was no science, in fact. They had one methylated spirits tube which they used when they had to heat something or other. Nobody was particularly good at maths because it was so out of kilter with the rest of it. And I suppose I had a bit of luck that the only maths exam I passed after about second year happened to be the O-level. So much later, when I applied to go to Glasgow University, an O-level in maths was an indispensable qualification, and that was as far as I got. I sat and failed the higher maths. I got the other highers. The sort of education happened to suit me fine, being what we would much later call an arts education with some basis in languages. And much later in life I became the university lecturer in Italian, and then later a professor. So I'm not going to be overcritical of the quality of the education that we got. It was very limited. It happened to suit me, but it was obviously very limited. Honestly, I do think at other times there could have been questions asked, was it really worthwhile having a junior seminary? Granted, the very limited number of people who actually went on to become priests, was it a worthwhile expenditure on the part of the church in Scotland? I'm genuinely unsure. And I was there at the time when we had just finished our 6th year. That was the time they were opening up Langbank College. So the 5 of us who were going abroad to Rome, 3 of us went to Rome, 2 to Spain, were invited. It was an invitation you couldn't refuse to go to Langbank over a couple of weeks in the summer so as to help setting the place up. Once again, it was a pleasant, enjoyable enough experience, and we did a lot of work for it, but and then that college had to be shut down fairly quickly when the numbers declined. There was that boom. So was Blairs actually a good idea? From the point of view of the church itself, I doubt if it was, actually. From the point of view of the individual, then granted that so very few actually ended up going into the priesthood, then the nature of the education was somewhat limited. It was not a problem for me or for some other people, but that's why such an enormous number of people in Blairs and who gave up, as the word was, have ended up as being lawyers. I mean, I read somewhere that Blairs has produced more lawyers in Scots law than any other single school. I'm not sure if that's true, but certainly a large number, because there were so many other things that you wouldn't go. So maybe the question you want to ask, do I regret going to Blairs or not? I've asked that question and I come to different answers. Overall, my answer is no. I was not maltreated. I don't think I suffered any terrible handicap or in any way drawback. There were, years good and bad. They were happy, unhappy, as would be the case in any walk of life, actually. I'm very, very glad of having been sent to Rome. And indeed, it's often occurred to me that in many ways, what was in many ways the most important decision of my life, the one which set my course, was not taken by me, was taken by the Bishop of Motherwell when he chose to send me to Rome. And that was the way I went on. I became, eventually I did a degree in modern languages. I became a lecturer in Italian, eventually a professor.
Interesting. And you mentioned there the profs there. Can you remember who your form master was?
Yeah, it was Dav Brun, Father David Brown. Yes, he was initially, for the first couple of years, then Danny Boyle, and I imagine his name will come up very frequently in these discussions. When he was appointed rector in Valladolid in Spain, Dav Brun became Master of Discipline, and it was Father Koya who took over for the last couple of years. Very different personalities, but yeah.
And do you have memories of hijinks and antics in the form rooms that you can share?
Well, first of all, the form rooms only came when we were fairly senior students, when they decided that the old house, which had been the original college, it was lying uselessly empty, and so they decided they could use them. But I think I'm right in saying it was 4th year, the year which for me was the beginning of my hospitalisation. I think it was only that time. When I come back, I might have been a more solitary individual than the rest of them. It was at that time that I really acquired, a love of reading. Now, when I was in hospital, once again I had a bit of luck. This had been a sanatorium, And there is a condition known as adolescent tuberculosis, which obviously was what I had. So they had made provision in Tornadee for people in their teens that were there. And there was a special room where they had a very good library, and also records and so on. It's where I discovered jazz. I'm not really particularly musical, but they a great many of them. When I went back to Blairs, I'm afraid that during the playtime or the recreation or the final hour, I preferred to go off on my own and to read rather than go over, to the form room. The main hijinks that I remember, and it wasn't all that high, was that there was a radio in the forum room, which had been prohibited before, and also there were some classrooms. And this, if I remember, the first class was, I can't remember, let's say 9:15, it might have been earlier than that. So we would rush over and go against all the rules into the forum room and switch on the radio, where there was a not exactly a record programme, but it was something like Housewife's Choice, it might have been called. And that was the time of the emergence of the Beatles. And I remember our forum discovering the Beatles and being allowed. I remember we were in there, and we were in there. We were not allowed to be in at that time, but we would go in, and somebody would keep their eye to see the professor coming over and rush up. Didn't always work, so we got bawled out on various occasions for acting illegally. But I remember us thinking, the Beatles, that this was our group, the form, that we'd found them. We were almost disappointed to discover that they were growing in popularity, that the unwashed millions outside. And I remember also being disappointed with them, because there was a record which was not one of the great ones. It was called Twist and Shout. And I think I'm right in saying that the Beatles had not actually, John and Paul had not actually written this themselves. It was somebody else's music. I may be wrong in that. Anyway, we were a bit disgusted by this and disappointed, and we were afraid that our group were now going to descend into being just one of the many hodgepodge pop groups going about at that time. I think we can back onto them there, but that's actually one of my clearest memories. That wasn't exactly anything riotous, but we were sneaking in to listen to the radio at a time when it was not permitted. Because even the records, there was a record player, and there were records which could be bought from the money which we put into it. But Father Coya, when he became housemaster, was very meticulous, and if we said we wanted such and such a record, he disapproved in general, because these were pop songs and he didn't like that. But being a very thorough and, open-minded in his own way, he went to listen to the records, but then he would report back with us saying he listened to them and there was nothing in them, there was nothing worthwhile. And he said he'd even gone into shops in Aberdeen where there were these little studios, and he would listen to them twice or maybe even 3 times before saying, no, this is utterly vacuous, this is not what we expect of a Blairs boy, and normally turned the request down. Not always, but in general he did.
Very interesting that you say that the illegal activity of running over to put the radio on. I can definitely reveal that a similar thing was happening in the 80s when we were there as well. So,
well, there you are. Some things don't change.
Absolutely right. Here's quite a general question. What was the most enjoyable thing about Blairs for you?
Oh, unquestionably be the companionship. As I say, I think I was lucky. I suppose I was quite studious, and the kind of courses, if I can say this without sounding vainglorious, I've got a sort of knack for languages. It's what became my career. I was a professor in the university. So the fact that you were doing 3 languages, Latin, Greek and French, suited me fine. That was the only one. I believe they later introduced Spanish, which they could have done. I enjoyed the English course and the history. I always felt, even then, very sorry for the people trying to teach maths, because they were running up against a sort of wall of opposition which was inbuilt. It was partly the consequence of the nature of the overall course and of the interests of the people who were there. So I had no problem at that time with the education. I enjoyed the companionship. I was never much of I loved and love football, but I was never a good player. So that was obviously a serious handicap. Mm.
Mm-hmm. And what was, I guess, the opposite? What was the least enjoyable thing for you?
Strange. I would be struggling after the initial impact of the place. When for the first couple of weeks, I really was profoundly unhappy in that time. But thereafter, I don't remember. Well, the only answer I could give to say was that in my build, even then, I was not particularly good at any sport. I tried to cultivate table tennis as being one which I could manage, but I was that. I remember that being one of the most bad humiliations of my life, because I, in the house division, then you played all sports, and I was reasonably good at table tennis. But I had read in one of the, it wasn't actually in the Gospels, but if you prayed for something and believed that it would be granted, but the belief that it would be granted was indispensable to it. So I was playing for my house, which was Lourdes. No, it wasn't. It was Fatima, sorry, table tennis. And having prayed that I would win this game, I felt obliged to go around saying, I'll win out the park, I'll completely destroy, mollocate the guy I'm playing against. But I felt that was a spiritual need. I felt that was part of the nature of prayer and the confidence in the success of prayer. And of course I lost, which meant that I was regarded quite reasonably as a vacuous loudmouth, as a boaster and a braggart and so on. And there was no point saying yes, but I read in this spiritual book that if you pray for something, then you've got to express your confidence. So I was regarded for that time, and I understand why I was a braggart. I remember that as being a profound lesson to me, but it came out of an act of self-inflicted, or an act of humiliation to which I left myself open, even if for the loftiest of motives.
Yeah, a valuable life lesson, I guess.
Yeah, well.
You mentioned earlier that you were sacristan, and I'm not sure if I saw pride in your eyes, but I certainly felt envy in my heart. The role of sacristan was always seen as really quite a prized achievement in Blairs. Can you tell us how you felt being sacristan, the kind of duties you got involved with?
Oh yeah.
And I trust your name is on the wall or the door or the roof.
My name, yes, I have been back and I have seen my name on the door. I had forgotten about that. It was when the museum was there, it was the museum keeper who said, come and see. And it had completely gone from my mind. What disconcerted him was the fact that my name was only there twice, for fourth year and then for sixth year, but of course I missed out because of the medical problems. I'm not talking about that. No, and that was one of my concerns when I was in hospital. Obviously they had to appoint somebody else, Willie Fraser, who became a priest in Argyll in the Isles. He took over as sacristan when I was away. And I was worried I would not be reappointed, but they did put me back in. No, I thoroughly enjoyed that job from every point of view. I took it very seriously. I remember having impressed Jerry Marr, Father Jerry Marr, who was the priest in charge, and it was the custom to take out the ciboria and the chalices and give them a very thorough cleaning at Christmas time, and some of the ciboria or the pixies didn't come out, and then I went down the beginning of next term and I was cleaning them in my own time, and Jerry Marr discovered me doing that and was terribly impressed. Now I liked the whole thing. I liked the contact it gave you with the priests. I enjoyed setting out the vestments. I enjoyed the responsibility, especially in fourth year, the responsibility of having to lock up the back door. And I shall now tell you, and this is a true story, this is a ghost story about Blairs, and this happened to me. When there was a film shown, then obviously things went on later than normal. We went back to the chapel to say night prayers, and once night prayers were over, everybody got out very quickly because they were tired. Unfortunately, in that night, there was a priest there in the priest's section on the altar. He was not a member of staff and I'd never seen him before. But I had to wait until he finished his prayers and got out. To my utter dismay, he then started doing the Stations of the Cross. Now, I had gone and locked the public door. I had done it personally. And the communion rail, which separated the part where the boys were from the part where any other members of the congregation, had a very noisy lock which clicked every time. I knew that. I was doing this 3 times a day. And I may even have dozed off, and I looked up and discovered this priest was now in the back part of the church. But I hadn't heard the click, which I took as being a bit surprised. But however, these things could happen. I then may have dozed off again, and this time I saw him in the front of the church, in the boys' bit. And this time I knew, beyond any question, that he could not have come through the communion rail, that he could not have unlocked it. So I scuttled out of the church and raced up to the professor's corridor. I went into the first priest's room, which was Father Mannion, and I didn't knock the door. I rushed straight in, which obviously he didn't do. But fortunately, he wasn't in his pyjamas or anything, and he realised, I said, what's wrong? And I told him. So he sat me down, we chatted a bit and said, we'll go down and see what's happening. We went down, he took a torch, which was unnecessary because I had not switched off the lights. Nobody there. And the back door was locked. And he said there was no priest staying. So we switched off the lights and he took me back up and I went to bed. And the following day I was summoned by the rector, it was Canon Thompson. And here, I'm afraid the story becomes an anticlimax because there were many stories of ghostly figures around Blairs, many stories. And nobody quite disbelieved them, even if nobody altogether believed them. And he said, now, Joseph, I'm going to show you some photographs of people who have allegedly left a ghost and see, and said, calm yourself. And he turned them over and showed me. And as I say, at this point it becomes an anticlimax because none of them were in any way familiar. But he did insist there was no priest who was not a member of the staff who had been staying that night. So that remains as one of these mysteries of Blairs which you can add to the collection.
That is what I would claim, and I think that the executive producer will claim is gold for the purpose of what we're trying to achieve here. And having been, in inverted commas, the victim of many a ghost story in my time at Blairs, that one felt as genuine as any as I have heard. And what
I'll guarantee you it was a genuine story. I mean, I don't believe in ghosts, but this is what actually I saw, and I cannot think of any explanation. The door was shut, I'd shut it, the communion rail was noisy, I opened and shut it every day. I got out, and there was no rational explanation of what I had seen.
Well, just for the benefit of the tape, I feel as if we've hit the benchmark for ghost stories. So anyone else can pick up that challenge. One of the things that I remember at my time in Blairs was the importance that was given to the shows, the shows that were put on in the theatre at the end of the year. Gilbert and Sullivan typically. So do you have any memories of that kind of activity?
Yeah, I have several vivid memories. We didn't do Gilbert and Sullivan. We did Gilbert and Sullivan in the senior seminary in Rome, but it was never done when I was there. There was a musical done, but it was Father Ben Donachie, who in addition to being a very good French speaker and teacher, he was also the music master, and he wrote a one-act show which his own forum put on. I wasn't involved with it, but I remember it. Very, very well done. I acted in one or two of those, but my clearest memory is of a different thing. I was not in it, but it was our forum was putting it on, and I'd been helping with the direction. The direction was done by the forum master at that time, who was actually Father Morris. Anyway, I can't remember. He was doing that, and when it came to the night, there was a guy who had to walk on and to say one line. It's a terrible business. And the guy who was playing it was walking up and down beside the curtains. It's a terrible business. It's a terrible business. It's a terrible business. And I had to say to him, look, John, just hold on. When you go on, there's a trap door there, and we've lost the trap door. So there is now a hole there. Now, so you go on, take 2 steps and say a word. Right, Joe. It's a terrible business. Now, remember, John, 2 steps. If you take 3, you're going to go right down. John walked on, took 3 steps, vanished down there. All that was left was his head and shoulders, and seeing Head and Shoulders, the whole audience was in convulsions by this time. It's a terrible business. Well, the thing is, they thought the terrible business was the fact that he had actually gone under the stage planks and only his head and shoulders could be seen above it, but it wasn't. He was in such a state over this one single line that he could not keep in his head. 2 steps, John, and you're okay. 3 steps and you're finished.
And what a terrible business it ended up to be.
There was another bizarre thing. I don't think it was the same play. It was another guy. It was set in Ireland, and there were certain irreverent things which the forum master decided were too much. So he transferred the setting from Ireland to Scotland, and the church from the Catholic Church in Ireland to the Church of Scotland. I have no idea why. There was nothing in it particularly offensive. Anyway, one of the people in it, I think it was even the priest and the minister, was to mix together various chemicals, and then he was to hold it up to the light and to say, and I remember the line, "Begobs, it's blue." Now, of course, when we did the rehearsal, there were no chemicals, so he just put it, "Begobs, it's blue," and they put it down. On the night, we got various chemicals together, and of course, as was foreseeable, put them together, they turned pink, and the guy picked it up and said, "Begobs, it's blue." When the entire audience could see it was a sort of radiant pink that would have induced blindness in ordinary eyes. But these could happen in any way, in any sort of amateur dramatics, or even occasionally in professional dramatics. But these things were always good fun. These things were always highly enjoyable.
And always very much enjoyed by those looking on as well, which is terrific.
Yes.
So if you've clearly gone on to have a fantastically successful career, and you're a professor and so on. If you took time to reflect, what would you say? What did Blairs give you? As a man,
well, truthfully, I find it hard to answer that about Blairs. The experience of being in the Scots College in Rome gave me an enormous amount. I mean, that was really the decisive event for my life, and I'm enormously grateful to Bishop Scanlon, as he then was, and Motherwell, for sending me to Rome. So the encounter with Rome, with Italy, with Italian culture, really was absolutely had an enormous impact on the whole way from Blair, the way in which I lived subsequently. Blairs, I'm not sure that it offered me anything that I wouldn't have got in another school if I'd been going. I mean, as I said, I have no complaints about the education. I can understand people who are other reservations about it, but that was not my experience. I was able to cope with the kind of education they were doing, but I don't think it moulded me in any sort of particular way that was different from what would have happened in an ordinary school. I did 1 year in Our Lady's High in Motherwell before I went, and had I continued, the only thing I wonder is, would I have, done better with the sciences? Well, you could not have done worse with science. So granted, the nature of science teaching in Blairs, with all respect to Father John Kane, who was in charge of that, but he just didn't have the facilities to do it. But I'm not very sure.
Yeah, well, that's understandable. And I guess before we wrap up, is there anything else that when you were thinking about today that you're thinking you wanted to share with us that we haven't covered already?
Well, it was only one other thing. I mean, has anybody been in Blairs? In general, you had a cubicle of your own. There was nothing, it was as bare a cubicle as could be imagined. But in the period I was there was such an enormous number of students that they had to put 13 or 14 of us, I can't remember, I think it was fourth year rather than third year, into an open dorm. And that, from the point of view of discipline in the college, was a disastrous decision, because although we were bound to the grand silence and all the rest of it, we didn't get up to anything utterly ridiculous. Certainly nothing that was completely shameful, but there were what could be called high jinks, I suppose, one of which is utterly ridiculous. When one of the guys, for whatever reason, took somebody else's mattress and threw it out the window, so it ended up suspended in a tree below the window. The college decided to intervene, and one of the guys was actually expelled, and I'm really have never been convinced that he was worse than any of the rest of us, and so on. My main criticism would be something of that sort. There were some people who were expelled. Obviously, there were people who left, gave up, which is a very unfortunate phrase, but anyway, that was the one that was used, gave up at that sort of time. But some people were expelled or given what was known as a dome, that's to say, for those who don't have the jargon or the Latin, they went home for the holidays and told not to come back, that their possessions would be returned to them. And I do think that some terrible injustices were done to people of that sort. Even those who were, one in particular member who I presume was given a dome on academic grounds, but he wasn't struggling noticeably worse. He wasn't the brightest, if you like, but I thought that policy for the people affected was not one which would really bear investigation nowadays. The time, on the other hand, when we were in the open dormitory, and that may have been fourth year, so when I ended up in hospital, as I said, then we did not conform to the rules of the grand silence in particular, except in as far as we didn't want to make too much noise in case we were discovered. But that was only for a particular period because of the pressure of numbers on the place. And I suppose that's the year that stands out for me in every way.
And very interesting you say that about going from cubicles to a broader dormitory. By the time we had got there, your first 2 years, you were in a very open dormitory with lots of lads, certainly 20, 30 in the little dormitory, and even more in the next stage of the dormitory as you progress through.
Well, it was an experiment forced on them when we were there, just by the sheer weight of numbers, but I think they were fairly clear that they were not going to repeat it, or that was the impression I had, but obviously that was not the case.
Joe, it's been an absolute joy to listen to you.
A couple of things that have come up in other discussions that you've not touched on, Joe. I'm just curious to know any thoughts that you might have, and George, you might need to question this because the microphone's food. Excursions, getting out, did you escape as a group? We did hill walking, for example. So, George, you might need to repeat that because of the mic.
It's okay, you could see it being picked up. So, What are your memories, Joe, of the food at Blairs?
Well, I mean, the food was ludicrously bad, if you think of it in retrospect. I mean, one simply accepted it, but if you consider it basically, breakfast, afternoon tea and then supper were exactly the same, with tea that we called booze, and God knows how they managed to get stuff with that taste. They obviously used sweeteners and a certain amount of artificial milk. So we had that with these slices of bread, and it was rationed. There was one slice each. Certainly it was cut so thick that it might have made about 3 ordinary slices if it had been done in a more professional way. And then the fact that the food was the same, you know, every day, every Monday you got what was gloriously known as rat pie. Every Wednesday there was Irish stew. I can't remember, there was macaroni came on obviously fish on a Friday. And the fish varied. I never liked fish, which was a further problem. And my father was a butcher, so we were used to having meat. But the fish was of 2 types, and as we said, or as we used to say, we got the fish one week and then the bones the following week, which may have been the case. But I mean, if there had been an inspection of the sort there are nowadays by a dietitian, they'd have been horrified. There never was any fresh fruit, for example. We didn't get butter; it was margarine and so on. So the food was appalling. The thing that does strike me in retrospect is how tolerant we were of that, and also why there was no resentment of the fact that when the professors came to eat with us at lunchtime, they were on a different diet altogether and being served by the nuns. But I remember making occasional jokes about it, but there was not widespread resentment of the sort that would be. And when it occurred to me, when I went out to Rome, then the food was really, I thought, of a very high standard. They had a cook initially. In the first year I was there, then there were nuns come in, and we got very good food. And I remember there were 2 men there who were from an English diocese, Durham I think it was. Then one of them asked me what the food was, and I think it's marvellous. And he was appalled. He was appalled. He thought the food in Rome was dreadful. But as I was comparing it to Blairs, and I mean, you know, we had basically gone to heaven from that point of view, apart from the fact that we were getting wine regularly, but the standard of the food there. No, the food was utterly and absolutely deplorable. I mean, I remember describing it to my mother, and she was horrified that this was the stuff that we were getting. But, you know, we lived on the fresh air, I think.
Absolutely. Good Aberdonian fresh air. And in terms of excursions out of Blairs, do you have any recollections around those?
Well, these were so rare. I mean, even when we... certainly we were seniors, 50, to go along the front road, which was not that... there wasn't such a heavy traffic. You had to go and ask permission from the rector alone. So excursions meant only being able to walk up what were called the bounds, which was good fresh air and so on. Aberdeen was completely off unless you were going to the dentist or, well, I had to go, apart from being in hospital, I was then going back in for checkups and so on. So there was the one excursion a year on the Saints' Day when we were taken to somewhere. But the contact with the local community was negligible. In fact, it was virtually nil. I find it quite interesting, actually, in retrospect. As I said, I was more in Aberdeen than the average student would have been for these reasons. And then being in hospital, most of the people there were Aberdonians, and I was struck by the language and the contrast between the English or the Scots that was spoken in the city of Aberdeen as distinct from the language that was spoken along the D side where we were in sixth form. And that actually now is an interest that remained with me with the nature of Scots, Aberdonian Scots. This is a digression, but I'm translating a play just now from Italian into Scots, which we're going to put on. And I try and think back to the Aberdonians who spoke English, as I do. I speak English with a Scottish accent. They spoke with an Aberdonian accent. But when you were a couple of miles outside, along the D side, then you had people who spoke in very broad Scots, but very broad Aberdonian Scots. I remember once in particular, it was one of the rare summer days, it was very warm, and there was an old-fashioned well, but you had to pump the handle. And we stopped. We were doing no harm to anybody, just wanted a drink. And an aged, looked like a crofter, came out from there and was brandishing his walking stick above and shouting out, "Did he call a hollow loons?" Or loons, that was the word. "Did he call a hollow loons?" Now, I knew what the word loons meant, having been in hospital, where they referred to me as a loon and the girls were quines, or quinies actually. But this guy was a character out of the Bruins, as I said, brandishing his walking stick. "Did he call a hollow loons?" But we had very, very little contact with the people round about.
Okay. Joe, that's been terrific. Really, really appreciate it.
Well, there you are.
Just
There you are.
magnificent.